They said the soil of Cane Hollow ran red long before blood was spilled upon it, as if the land itself had been born guilty. It stretched across the low country like a scar, a vast expanse of rust-colored dirt and withering cane, shimmering under the merciless southern sun. The year was 1853, and the world beyond its borders was shifting, but Cane Hollow remained the same, ancient, cruel, and heavy with the weight of its own history. The plantation did not grow as much as it endured, each creaking board of the manor swollen with humidity and secrets. The house stood on a rise above the fields, white once, now yellowed and split like old bone. Its verandas sagged, its shutters hung crookedly, and from the upper rooms the wind carried whispers, half prayer, half confession. Those who worked the soil said the place was alive. They claimed it sighed when the rain came and groaned when thunder rolled, as though it feared judgment from above. At night, its silhouette loomed against the lightning, gaunt and watchful, its chimneys like raised fists begging the heavens for mercy that would never come. Inside, Silas Wren reigned. A man carved from iron and avarice, he had inherited both the land and its curse. His wealth was measured in flesh and acres, neither of which he tended with kindness. His voice carried like a whip crack. His gaze could still a room. To him, the world was a ladder of power, and he had clawed his way high enough to forget that ladders can fall. Yet even a man such as Silas harbored shame, a hidden rot beneath a fine coat and polished boots. That shame was his daughter. Evelyn Wren was born in the same chamber where her mother had died, and it seemed the room had never forgiven her for it. From infancy she was kept indoors, her skin pale as candle wax, her body soft, her spirit gentle and strange. While the other planters' daughters danced in the parlor and practiced charm, Evelyn hid behind thick curtains and porcelain dolls. The world beyond her window was one of laughter, judgment, and sweat, things she was too fragile to bear. As the years crawled on, her father's tenderness withered into contempt. Each meal became an accusation, each glance a wound. The townsfolk whispered that she had grown grotesque, that the Wren blood had turned bad. Silas heard every word, and each one stoked the fire of his disgust. He avoided her presence whenever possible. Yet there was no escaping what she represented. His legacy, his failure, his sin made flesh. The plantation's prosperity began to wane. The cotton was poor and creditors grew bold. The old empire he had built upon suffering began to crumble, and in his arrogance he looked for something, someone, to sacrifice. There was no God in Silas Wren's heart, only hunger, and when a man like that feels cornered, he will burn the very air he breathes. The narrator's voice lowers here, slow and grave, as if confessing to a crime older than words. Silas would not go to the banks, nor would he sell his land. Pride forbade it. But one night, as the cicadas screamed in the blackness and the moon burned red over the fields, an idea came to him, grotesque in its simplicity. A bargain, a trade of flesh for power, humiliation for debt. His daughter, the source of his shame, would become his payment. Not in coin, but in cruelty. He called it justice. The land called it vengeance. From the shadows of the veranda, the enslaved workers could see him pacing that night. The glow of his cigar, a small, hellish ember moving back and forth like an omen. They said the master had spoken aloud to the air, muttering names of old debts and old spirits. They said he laughed once, a sound so sharp that the dogs began to bark and would not stop until dawn. By morning he had summoned his overseer and given orders no man dared question. He wanted the best of his property, the strongest, the most defiant, brought to him by nightfall. Meanwhile, Evelyn, in her upstairs chamber, sat before her mirror, brushing her long, dull hair in the dim light. She heard the echo of boots below, the sound of men shouting, chains clinking faintly like wind chimes in a nightmare. The air smelled of storm and iron, and though she could not yet name it, she felt something turning in the house, something that had been sleeping, waiting beneath the floorboards. The walls seemed to tighten around her, the candlelight flickering as though the air itself recoiled from what was about to begin. Outside, the red soil shimmered under the rising heat, pulsing faintly like a wound that would not heal. It had seen generations of cruelty, but this would be different. This would be remembered. For Cane Hollow was not just a place of work and torment. It was an altar, and soon the first offering of blood and shame would be made upon it. By sundown, Silas stood before his house, staring out over the fields that had once made him powerful. His eyes were tired, but his soul, if he had one left, was alive with some terrible resolve. The slaves whispered as they passed that they could feel the ground breathing underfoot. Some claimed to hear faint voices beneath the soil, sighing like wind through bones. The house listened too. Its walls shivered. Its rafters moaned, and in the upper chamber, Evelyn Wren whispered a prayer she did not understand. A prayer not to God, but to something older, something that might listen when heaven would not. The narrator's tone hardens as the section closes. It was on that night, when the moon rose over the red fields of Cane Hollow, that the first sin was reborn, and the house, that ancient rotting witness, opened its eyes once more. What was the bargain Silas Wren intended to make? And why did the house seem eager to hear it? There are rooms in old houses that seem to remember their dead. Evelyn Wren's chamber was one such place, a shrine to silence and the slow decay of a life unlived. Its curtains were drawn against the world, thick velvet that trapped the heat and kept the air still. The wallpaper had once been pale blue, now yellowed with candle soot and age. The furniture was fine but tired, each piece polished by hands that trembled as they worked, as if afraid of what the room might do if neglected. At the heart of that room sat Evelyn, pale, soft, and spectral. Her face, round and sorrowful, reflected in the darkened mirror like a moon floating in still water. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice carried the faint tremor of someone who had learned long ago that words only brought ridicule. The servants who tended her did so with quiet pity, avoiding her eyes, for to meet them was to feel the strange, endless ache she carried. It was said that she never left the upper floor, not even to attend Sunday service. The master forbade her, of course. Her size, her slowness, her appearance would bring shame, he said. Shame to his name, to his house, to his blood. So she became a ghost while still alive. She spent her days reading the old family Bible, its margins filled with her mother's neat handwriting, and at night she wrote letters, pages upon pages, to no one in particular. To a friend she'd never had. To a God who'd stopped answering long ago. She would seal them carefully, stack them in a wooden chest, and never send a single one. For who in all of Cane Hollow would ever write her back? The narrator's voice drips with melancholy here, that kind of pity reserved for souls already buried by loneliness. The only warmth Evelyn knew came from the meals brought by trembling hands, bread soaked in gravy, heavy meats, sugared fruits. Her father saw to it that she was fed, not loved. Her body became the record of that cruelty. Each pound another page in the story of neglect. And though the house was full of noise, the crack of whips, the shouts of overseers, the rustle of skirts, and the murmurs of prayers, none of it reached her heart. She lived as if behind glass, watching life through the haze of her own captivity. But something was changing in her. There were nights when she awoke to the sound of weeping, not her own, but distant, echoing through the walls. She would sit up, candle flickering, listening. It was as though the house itself breathed around her, sighing with some secret pain. On one such night, she thought she heard a voice whisper her name. Not cruelly, not mockingly, softly, almost kind. She rose, walked to the door, but the hall was empty. Only shadows, only the smell of old wood and something faintly metallic, like rust. Or blood. Downstairs, her father had begun to drink more. The debts had grown. The cotton rotted in the fields, and the workers murmured about a curse. Silas dismissed it as superstition, but his temper grew short, his patience brittle. He could not bear the sight of Evelyn anymore. To him she was the embodiment of failure, the ruin of beauty, the ruin of pride. He ordered her windows nailed shut after she was seen watching the slaves in the yard. A wren does not look down upon the dirt, he said, though he himself was built from it. Evelyn obeyed as always. Yet that night she dreamt of the soil, red, wet, alive. In her dream she pressed her hands into it, and it sighed beneath her touch, welcoming her. She awoke with her palms sweating and her pulse racing. Something deep within her, something that had long lain dormant, began to stir. The narrator lingers. There comes a moment in every prisoner's life when obedience dies, and all that remains is hunger. For Evelyn, that hunger was not of the body. It was of the soul, a hunger to be seen, to be wanted, to be touched without disgust. So when her father climbed the stairs one humid evening, his face flushed with drink, his boots leaving marks on the carpet like bruises, She felt that something terrible and divine was about to be set in motion. He entered her room without knocking. The door groaned. Even it seemed unwilling to witness what would come next. Silas looked at his daughter for a long moment, his eyes hard as river stones. She sat silently, hands folded in her lap, her nightgown clinging to her arms in the heat. The silence between them stretched thin like glass about to shatter. Then at last he spoke, not with tenderness but calculation. His words were low, deliberate, as though rehearsed. He told her she would soon be joined, that her loneliness would be remedied, that a husband had been chosen, someone humble enough to take her hand, grateful enough to accept her company. His voice dripped with false mercy, every word a dagger wrapped in silk. Evelyn did not understand, not yet. She nodded once, quietly, her eyes cast down. When he left, the air in the room turned colder, heavier. The house seemed to creak in disapproval. She rose and went to the window, pressing her palm against the nailed boards. Outside, the wind whispered through the cane fields. The moon veiled in haze looked sickly, its light the color of old parchment. Somewhere below in the slave quarters, a distant hymn drifted upward, sorrowful, steady, and endless. Evelyn listened until her eyes filled with tears, and in that moment something inside her cracked, a small, invisible fissure in a soul too long constrained. The narrator's voice fades to a whisper. That night, the daughter of Cane Hollow prayed not for salvation, but for change. And the house, it hurt her. Who was the husband her father had chosen? And why did the earth itself seem to stir when his name was spoken? There are nights when the air feels too heavy to breathe, when even the wind refuses to move as if holding its breath for the sins about to unfold. That was the kind of night Silas Wren chose to make his bargain. The moon hung swollen above the plantation like an unblinking eye, casting the red earth in a pale, ghostly sheen. The oaks that lined the yard swayed faintly, their roots deep and ancient, as though they too sensed what was to come. Beneath those oaks, Silas assembled his kingdom, the overseers in their worn coats, the slaves in rough lines before him. The torches bled smoke into the night, painting every face in trembling orange light. The air smelled of sweat and iron and something else, anticipation, thick and sour. The narrator's tone is reverent, almost biblical. Every man gathered there knew that something unnatural was being born, though no one yet had the words for it. At the end of the line stood Jonas, tall, broad-shouldered, and silent. His eyes held no fear, only the calm of a man who has long accepted pain as a language the world speaks fluently. The others avoided looking at him directly. They knew Silas despised him most of all, not for his strength but for his mind. Jonas had a way of meeting the master's gaze that unsettled him, as if he could see through the skin and into the rot beneath. Silas called him forward. The overseers shifted. The torches hissed. Evelyn, pale and trembling, was brought from the house, dressed not as a bride but as a sacrifice. Her hair was pinned high, her gown yellowed by age and sweat, the lace clinging to her like spiderwebs. She stared straight ahead, her expression hollow, her lips trembling not from fear but disbelief. She had not spoken since her father's decree, and now, before God and every trembling soul on that cursed land, the master spoke his sentence. He announced that his daughter, Evelyn Wren, would take a husband, and that husband would be the slave named Jonas. He said it loudly, with the tone of a man proclaiming justice. But it was no union, it was punishment. For her body, her shame, her father's disgust. For Jonas's quiet defiance, his intelligence, his unwillingness to bow completely. The enslaved gasped softly, their chains whispering in the dirt. The overseers exchanged uneasy glances. Even the cicadas had gone silent. The narrator pauses, voice low. There are moments when cruelty becomes ceremony, when a man mistakes his own madness for law. A table was dragged from the porch. Upon it lay a Bible, its cover cracked with age. Silas did not touch it. Instead, he motioned for the overseer to begin. No preacher came. No vows were spoken. Only the sound of the whip cracking once across the earth, a symbol of dominion and of desecration. The witnesses bowed their heads not in reverence but in shame. Jonas stood unmoving. His eyes met Evelyn's for the first time, not as man and woman, not as master and slave, but as two souls bound by the same cruel hand. Something passed between them then, something unseen but real, like an old spirit recognizing its reflection in another. She did not look away. Silas mistook her stillness for obedience and smirked. He believed he had broken 2 lives with a single act. But the narrator reminds us, a man who believes he owns the earth soon finds the earth owns him. The ceremony ended without applause. The torches were extinguished one by one. The overseers drifted back to their quarters, uneasy, muttering of curses and omens. The slaves returned to their cabins in silence. For to speak was to summon the wrath of God or man. And in Cane Hollow, they were one and the same. Only Silas remained standing beneath the oak tree, looking up at the moon as though daring it to judge him. The wind rose suddenly, rattling the branches above. A shower of dead leaves fell around him, sticking to his sweat-slicked skin. He wiped his brow and spat into the dirt, muttering that the land itself was too soft, too damp. He did not notice that the soil where he stood had darkened, glistening faintly like wet clay, or like flesh. From the balcony above, Evelyn watched her father walk back into the house, his figure swallowed by the lantern glow. She clutched the railing until her fingers turned white. She wanted to scream, but the sound that came out was something quieter, a low hum, almost a lullaby, trembling with rage and sorrow. Down below, Jonas lifted his eyes to the house. His face was unreadable, but his jaw tightened. There was no defeat in him, only patience. The kind of patience the earth knows, the kind that outlives masters. The night grew still again, but not empty. There was a weight in the air, as if the world itself had taken a breath and forgotten how to exhale. The soil seemed to pulse beneath the torch's dying embers, a heartbeat buried deep. The slaves would later whisper that it was then, in that single moment, that Cane Hollow truly came alive. Silas slept that night as if nothing had changed. But beneath his roof, in the darkened chamber of his daughter, everything had. The narrator's voice lowers, almost tender now. The master had made his bargain. The house had accepted, and somewhere deep beneath the red earth the roots began to move. What then had Silas truly awakened? And who, among the living and the buried, would answer first? The house swallowed the night like a secret it meant to keep. Heat clung to the corridors, a damp animal breath rising from the floorboards, and every candle seemed to burn lower than it should, as if the wax itself feared a longer vigil. Somewhere beyond the nailed windows, the fields of cane whispered to themselves, blade to blade, a language of dry rasp and hidden water. The hour had come, not with joy or ritual, but with the steady, pitiless march of a clock that had timed 1,000 punishments before this one. They brought Jonas through the side door so that the front hall would not remember his footsteps. Bare boards received him, warm from the day's heat and sticky where spills had never truly been scrubbed away. He was unbound, though watched as if shackled by a ring of invisible iron. It was a courtesy meant to humiliate rather than honor, a staged civility that dared him to act like a man in a world that refused to call him one. 2 floors above, Evelyn Wren sat with hands folded in her lap, listening to the house assemble its old courage. She felt the weight of her hair at her neck, the pinch of stitched lace at her shoulders, the gravity of fabric made for a thinner dream. There was a tremor in her elbows that did not reach her fingers, a trembling held back by something older than fear, not resolve, not yet, something like listening. The door to her room opened with the slow scrape of wood against wood, a sound that seemed to peel a layer from the air. Jonas stepped inside and stopped, taking the measure of the dimness. The bed hung in gauze like a pavilion for an insect queen, the mirror shrouded with a white sheet that bulged as though someone breathed beneath it. He and Evelyn regarded each other without parlor politeness or words because, what could words do here? Words were a stairway built from rotten treads. Step hard enough and you were through. The candle between them made a small citadel of light, its walls low, siege already begun. The house, remembering other nights, settled one joint at a time. In this room a woman had labored and failed. In that room a boy had coughed out a year's worth of winters in one August night. In the cellar the pickled fruits had exploded once in an ancient summer, lids popping like musket fire from ferment too long ignored. History sweated through the plaster. The red earth outside pressed its patient mouth to the foundation stones and tasted for cracks. Evelyn lifted her gaze first. It crossed the floor and rested on Jonas like a hand, not possessive, not pleading, simply human. It startled her to realize she had not looked at anyone that way in years. The wedding night, then. A night made by decree, stripped of blessing, starved of dignity, meant to be an act performed not by 2 but upon 2. The master's law still clung to the air like smoke. the residue of a sentence spoken to satisfy a hunger that had nothing to do with bodies. The narrator, a patient and cruel historian of this place, notes that rooms have appetites too. They crave confession, they savor humiliation, but sometimes, rarely, they hunger for release. Jonas moved no closer. He remained a distance away that recognized the size of the chamber and the size of what had been asked. He stood like a figure cut from a darker wood than the chair or the wardrobe, grain tight, not easily split. For a long span of heartbeats, their breathing found a rhythm and then lost it again. The moth that had been battering itself against the glass chimney of the candle settled, seared wing scissoring open and shut as if measuring the temperature of fate. In the hallway, a floorboard, one of the long ones that ran the length of the upper gallery, let out a thin cry. The watcher stationed beyond the door shifted his weight, then remembered himself and stilled. Below, somewhere near the back stair, a jug was raised and lowered. The house drank too. Evelyn felt the seam, not of her dress, but of the life she had been stitched into. She understood with the clarity that fever brings, that whatever occurred in this room had already been decided for her, and that to submit or to refuse would be counted the same coin by the man who minted the currency of her days. Some forms of obedience are merely different pronunciations of defiance, and some forms of defiance are only obedience pronounced in a stranger's tongue. She realized, too, that pity was a cruelty in its own right, salt mistaken for balm. She did not want his pity. She did not want his revulsion. She wanted witness. She wanted to be seen and not catalogued. So the night uncoiled between them, slow and low to the ground. The description of what followed belongs to the house, which has always been better at keeping the edges of a scene than the center. There were movements that did not break the air, touches the candle did not find, breath that returned to the body that released it. There was restraint that was not refusal and mercy that arrived without bargain. Where another script might swerve toward spectacle, this one walks the perimeter and marks the quiet facts. That two people placed in a machine may, for an hour, jam its teeth. That the body has ways of remaining its own. That proximity can be a rebellion when possession is the law. After, there was the sound of water poured from a pitcher into a basin, and the metal rang like a bell from a country both of them remembered, but had never seen. There was the creak of the sash when the smallest gap was pried between board and frame to invite a filament of night air into the room. And the gap smelled of cane and iron and the bitter narcotic of crushed green things. There was the hush that falls when a storm chooses a different house. The watcher outside dozed and woke and dozed again. Time, that cruel overseer, made his rounds and found nothing he could use. Downstairs, a mouse crossed the dining room like a scandal looking for an ear. The clock in the hall decided to skip a chime and regretted it immediately. Jonas stood at the window and pressed his palm to the nailed slats, and the cool leached from the wood into his bones. In that small exchange, something of the house learned his shape. Evelyn sat at the dressing table and brushed her hair with the slow gravity of an oath, each stroke a counting, each counting a naming. When silence had thickened again, the floor beneath the bed let out a sound not made by weight or age. It came from lower, through the joists, through the beams, through the brick piers sunk into the soil. A soft tremor, a hush with a pulse, a pressure that rose and kissed the arch of the house, then retreated. The candle guttered sideways. Jonas looked from the window. Evelyn's brush slowed in the air and came to rest. A second tremor followed, no louder yet undeniable, as if a vault door beneath the property had shifted on its hinges, as if the diary of the earth had decided to add a line. The night pressed its ear to the boards and listened. The house, remembering the cellar, remembered also a dampness that had once been called a leak, and then a seep, and then a nuisance, and then a nothing. It remembered a dark place where fruit sweated in jars and brine learned every surname stored upon its shelves. It remembered the spring that sometimes bled into the far wall after rains, and the way the water carried a color it should not have carried. It remembered, because houses do, being asked to hold more than weight, to hold secrets, to hold dread, to hold the slow truths no one can haul into daylight without breaking. Tonight that burden shifted, redistributing itself through timber and nail. When morning thought about arriving but did not yet commit, a bird outside took a single experimental note and swallowed it. Jonas returned to the center of the room. Evelyn stood. Neither of them was less alone exactly, but neither of them was precisely the same shape the door had admitted. Some nights are bridges, This one had been a raft loosed from its moorings and allowed to drift an inch from the dock. Nothing more, nothing less. Distance enough to know there was water, and that water moved. The watcher outside cleared his throat to announce that he existed, and the house, irritated, clicked in its joints. Evelyn placed the brush upon the table. Jonas set his hand upon the bedpost, a gesture that meant nothing to anyone else and everything to the wood. From below, deep and patient, the earth exhaled again, the faintest pressure of breath rising through the brick piers into the bones of the manor, into the ribs of the room where 2 human hearts had refused to beat to the master's tempo. Dawn would come, and with it orders, and with them the inventorying of what could be counted and what could not. But before the light found a reason to enter, the candle shivered in a draught from nowhere and went out, leaving the wick a tiny red eye. In that instant of perfect dark, a trick of perception or a truth beyond it, Evelyn felt the floor lean toward her, as if the house itself had shifted closer to hear what she would decide next. What was it that breathed beneath Cane Hollow? Water? Wind? Or something that remembered every cruelty asked of the soil and now stirred to answer? The summer deepened into a cruel and heavy season. The air hung thick with the perfume of decay, a sweetness that did not belong to flowers but to something buried, breathing beneath the soil. The cane bent low as though under an invisible hand. The fields of Cane Hollow no longer sang with the rhythm of labor. Instead, they murmured like thousands of unseen mouths whispering beneath the ground. It began with small stories, murmured at dusk among the enslaved who gathered near the quarters, their eyes darting toward the horizon where the house loomed against a bleeding sunset. They said Miss Evelyn walked the fields at night, that she moved through the rows barefoot, her nightgown dragging in the dirt, her pale skin ghost-like under the moon. Some swore they heard her humming, old plantation hymns that no white lips had ever sung, words twisted in sorrow and praise. Others whispered that she did not hum at all but listened, knelt in the rows pressing her ear to the red earth as if it were speaking to her. The overseer, Mr. Cane, scoffed at first. He said women of her kind didn't walk past the veranda steps, but then he found her footprints, small, deep, and bare, trailing through the field one humid dawn. The sight chilled him, though he could not say why. Perhaps it was the shape of them, too steady, too deliberate, as though she were following something unseen. Jonas, meanwhile, had grown quiet. The man who once stood tall now walked slowly, his back bent, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. The others thought he was breaking, that the master's cruelty and the weight of his strange union had crushed the life from him. But those who listened closely heard him whisper at night, stories, songs, fragments of another world, words not meant for the white man's tongue, tales of spirits that lived in roots and rivers, of ancestors who watched through soil, of gods who slept until they were remembered. Evelyn began to listen. At first from her window, then from the shadows of the hallway, and finally, when darkness cloaked the house, beside him in secret. He would speak of his homeland, not as a place of geography but of memory. He told her the earth was alive, that it could hunger and forgive, that it knew every cruelty buried within it. And Evelyn, whose life had been confined by walls, felt something awaken in her chest. She began to dream of the ground not as dirt but as a body, a living thing that might cradle her where no arms would. The narrator's voice darkens. A woman who has never been held will mistake the whisper of the wind for love. Soon Evelyn began to wander. When the moon rose full and white, she slipped from her room and drifted down the veranda steps like smoke. The dogs did not bark. The overseers did not wake. She would walk among the cotton rows and hum the songs she had learned in secret. Her voice floated through the fields like a lost soul. Some who heard it said the stalks trembled, bowing as she passed. Others said the ground pulsed faintly, as though her song stirred something ancient beneath. One evening, Jonas followed her. He found her kneeling in the dirt, her hands buried wrist-deep in the red soil, eyes closed, lips moving in prayer. Not a Christian prayer, something older, rawer, closer to the bone. Her body rocked gently, her hair unbound, the moonlight tracing her face like baptism. Jonas watched silently, afraid to speak, for the air around her felt charged, not with madness but with presence, the kind that makes a man forget his breath. The next morning, the overseer went to Silas. He said the girl was turning strange, that she talked to the earth and sang songs she could not have known. He warned that the slaves were whispering, that some believed she was bewitched. Silas laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Let her sing," he said. "If she's mad, she's her mother's daughter." Then, as though to prove he was unshaken, he ordered the overseer to double the quotas for the week. The fields must not rest, but that night, when the house settled and the wind began to crawl across the veranda, Silas woke. It was the sound that roused him, faint, almost tender, but close. A humming. The melody rose and fell just beyond his door, slow and mournful, carrying the rhythm of a chain dragging through sand. He sat upright in bed, his breath sharp, sweat prickling his neck. The tune was one he recognized, though he had never known its words. A hymn he had heard once from the fields after a whipping, a song of mourning for the dead. He reached for his pistol and called her name, but the humming did not stop. It grew louder, not angry, not taunting, but steady, patient. It seeped through the wood like water through cracks, filling the room. When he tore open the door, the hallway was empty. Only the candle by her portrait flickered, its flame stretching sideways as if pulled by a breath. The narrator lowers his voice. That was the first night the master feared his own house. In the days that followed, Silas avoided the fields. He forbade anyone to speak of the humming, though the workers continued to hear it. Some claimed the sound came from the well behind the house, as if the earth itself were singing. Others said they saw Evelyn at dawn, her gown soaked to the hem, her hands stained red. They said she whispered to the dirt, and the dirt whispered back. That the ground had begun to answer her. Even Jonas could not meet her gaze anymore. There was something in her eyes, not cruelty but knowledge, as if she had seen the roots beneath the world and understood the shape they made. At supper she no longer ate. The servant said she fed the earth instead, scattering her bread, pouring her wine into the soil. By the week's end, the cotton began to die. The leaves curled, the stems wilted. No disease, no insects, and just stillness. The air grew heavy with the smell of metal. The red soil darkened as though drinking. Silas cursed the sky, but the sky did not answer. One night, as thunder rolled in the distance, Evelyn returned from the fields covered in mud. She left footprints down the hallway leading to her father's study. The servant swore they saw her hand on his door, her lips moving in silence before she turned away. When morning came, Silas found the handle rusted, as if years had passed overnight. The narrator breathes the final line of the chapter like a curse. The girl had learned the language of the soil, and the soil, once spoken to, never forgets the sound of its name. What did the earth tell her that night, and how much more would it demand to be fed? There are summers when the world itself seems to sour. The air thickens until it clings to the skin like oil, and the nights no longer bring relief, only the stench of something festering just beyond sight. That was how the season turned at Cane Hollow, a summer of still heat and slow rot. The insects swarmed in clouds that glimmered like dust over the fields, but even they seemed hesitant to land on the soil. The dogs would not go near the house. The horses refused the stables. And inside something had begun to decay that was not made of flesh. It started with a smell. A faint sourness that rose from beneath the floorboards, curling through the cracks like invisible smoke. The servants noticed first. They whispered that the cellar had gone bad, that the barrels of salt pork had spoiled overnight, though they had been sealed tight as tombs. The cook swore she saw condensation forming on the walls in the morning, thick, slow drops that left streaks down the plaster the color of dried blood. She begged Silas to let her scrub it clean, but he would not listen. To him, superstition was a worse disease than rot. By the week's end, the smell had worsened. It settled into the curtains, the bed sheets, the very breath of the place. No matter how many candles were lit, the air tasted like iron. Flies gathered near the cellar door, thick and noisy, as if drawn to something sweet beneath. Silas ordered the servants to burn incense and lime, but the odor only deepened, sharper, more alive. It was as though the house itself were decomposing. The animals began to die next. First a hen, then 3, then a dog that had been loyal for years. Its body was found stiff by the back steps, eyes wide, teeth bared. No marks, no wounds, only a faint smear of red soil beneath its paws. The slaves in the quarter said the earth had poisoned them, that it was angry, that something buried beneath Cane Hollow was hungry again. Silas laughed at their fear, but his voice shook. The overseer, Cane, tried to bury the dog, but the ground rejected it, the shovel striking something solid just inches down like bone or stone. He covered the hole and said nothing more, then Jonas vanished. For 3 nights no one saw him. The quarters whispered that he had gone into the ground, that he had followed the girl into her madness. Evelyn, pale and sleepless, said he was with her beneath. Her words slipped out like prophecy, soft, certain, unanswerable. She stopped eating altogether. When her father confronted her, she smiled faintly and said only, "The earth remembers who it fed." The narrator lingers. Some truths are so large they can only be spoken in riddles. Silas struck her once, out of desperation or fear. No one knew. After that, she did not speak again. She spent her days standing by the window, her hands resting on the sill, humming to herself. At night, the humming deepened, and sometimes, when the moon was full, it came from two voices instead of one. Silas could bear no more. On the fourth morning, he ordered the cellar opened and every inch of it torn up. "Find the source," he commanded. But when he gave the order, not a man moved. The servants crossed themselves. The slaves refused outright, shaking their heads and backing away. One muttered that the roots were bleeding. Another claimed to have seen something moving down there, a ripple beneath the dirt like something alive. Silas's temper broke. He seized a lantern, snatched a crowbar, and stormed toward the cellar door. The hinges screamed when he opened it, the darkness below swallowing the light whole. The air that rose to meet him was damp and foul, thick as breath from a corpse's mouth. He shouted for men to follow, but none did. Even the overseer looked away. The descent was slow. Each step creaked beneath his boots, echoing into blackness. The lantern flame wavered, painting the walls with trembling gold. The smell grew unbearable, sweet and metallic, the odor of something both dead and growing. The stone steps slicked with moisture, and the earth beneath them seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat muffled by distance. At the bottom, he stopped. The cellar stretched before him, its brick walls sweating, its shelves heavy with jars that gleamed faintly in the light. But the floor was wrong. It was no longer hard-packed soil. It had softened, swollen, risen in places like a blister. As he stepped closer, the ground shivered beneath him. The narrator's tone becomes a whisper. When the past moves, it is never upward. He crouched and touched the earth. It was warm, too warm, and when he drew back his hand, it came away slick with something dark and viscous. The lantern shook. Beneath his feet, a sound began, faint, rhythmic, wet. The same sound a body makes when turning in shallow water. He stumbled back, lifting the light higher. The soil bulged again, then split open. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw something. A hand, perhaps, or a tangle of roots shaped like one. The lantern's flame leapt wildly, casting monstrous shadows across the walls. He dropped it, and the oil spilled, fire leaping onto the damp earth. The ground hissed, recoiling like flesh against heat. A low sound filled the cellar. Not quite a scream, not quite a sigh, and Silas fled. When he burst back into the hall, his face was pale as chalk, his eyes wild. He ordered the cellar sealed, nailed shut, and forbidden to all. The servants obeyed without question. For days afterward, they heard scraping sounds from beneath, faint but steady, like something clawing its way toward the light. The narrator's voice falls to a cold whisper. Rot is not merely the undoing of life. It is memory breaking its silence. That night, Evelyn stood at her window again, watching the stars fade into mist. The house groaned beneath her feet, restless and alive. She pressed her palm to the glass and whispered something no one else could hear. The air outside stirred. The soil, black and glistening beneath the moon, rippled once, as if in reply. What had Silas awakened beneath his own home? And if the earth could bleed, what else could it do? Cane Hollow felt quiet after Silas ordered the cellar sealed. The house's noises changed. No longer the familiar breathing of old timber, but a listening stillness as if it had pressed its ear against the ground. The odor that had haunted the halls did not vanish. It only hid beneath the perfume of vinegar and lie, the way guilt hides beneath prayer. Silas Wren did not sleep. He drank at dusk and watched the flame of the lamp stretch long and thin on the wall, imagining it was the same flame he had dropped below. Every night he heard something, a scrape, a shift, the faint sound of damp earth sighing. He told himself it was rats. He told himself many things, but he kept the pistol by his bed. Outside, the world continued its slow undoing. The cane stalks blackened at their roots. The crows gathered on the roof beams, silent as judges. The enslaved kept their distance from the manor, making wide circles through the fields, whispering charms to the soil. They said the master had broken the pact of the earth. They said the girl had woken what slept. Jonas did not return. His absence filled the corridors like another scent, emptiness thick enough to choke on. Some nights Evelyn spoke to the dark as though he stood beside her. She told it stories. She laughed softly. Once, a servant swore he saw 2 shadows beneath her door when the candle burned only one. Silas could bear the whispers no longer. On the 3rd night, the noise came again, louder, closer, a low dragging sound beneath the floor. He rose, half-drunk, lantern in hand, and went to the locked cellar door. The nails had rusted in 3 days. When he pried them free, a smell came up that turned his stomach, and the flame in his lantern bent away from the opening as though it, too, wished to flee. He descended. The steps groaned, but the house did not protest. The deeper he went, the warmer it grew until sweat pooled in his palms. The air quivered. The lantern's glow reached only so far before it was swallowed. The shelves along the walls had collapsed, glass shards glittering in the dirt like teeth. The floor was not the same shape as before. It had sunk in the center, a wide depression ringed with ridges like the print of some vast kneeling thing. He stepped closer. The soil shifted, not as a solid, but as muscle beneath skin. The ridges pulsed. The heat came not from fire but from within. A wet sigh escaped the ground, and he thought, foolishly, that it was the earth exhaling. Then he saw the color. It glistened red-black, the hue of blood that has learned patience. Silas whispered a curse and raised the lantern higher. The light trembled across the hollow, and for an instant he saw what lived there. It was neither root nor worm, but something between. The earth folding in upon itself, sprouting veins, weaving fibers that beat like hearts. Within that tangle glimmered fragments of bone, cloth, and something pale that might have been skin, and from the center rose a breath, slow and wet, forming the shape of a face that had not yet decided whose it would be. He dropped the lantern again. Flame ran across the floor in quick veins, licking the walls. The thing recoiled, shrank, then swelled back, hungry for air. He stumbled up the stairs, but the steps seemed longer than before, each one clinging to his boots like a mouth. He burst through the door and slammed it behind him. For a moment all he could hear was the roar of his own pulse. When dawn came, the servants found him sitting in the hall, his hair gone white at the temples, his hands black with soot. He ordered the cellar sealed again, stone over wood, and swore anyone who broke it would hang. They obeyed. The house held its breath. After that night, Silas changed. His voice lost its thunder. He no longer struck the workers or shouted at Evelyn. He walked with a tremor, glancing often at the floor as though it might open. The overseer claimed he saw the master whisper to himself, mouthing prayers he did not know. Evelyn, meanwhile, grew calmer. She spent her mornings by the window and her nights humming low songs that made the glass tremble. The narrator's tone turns cold. A man may seal a door, but never the consequence that waits behind it. One afternoon, when the heat was worst and the air shimmered like water, a fissure appeared across the dining room floor, thin, red, damp at the edges. No one dared speak of it. That evening, Silas covered it with a rug and poured salt in a circle around his chair. But beneath the floorboards, something moved still, slow, rhythmic, patient. If the master had looked closer, would he have seen his own reflection stirring in that red soil? And when the earth remembers a man's name, does it ever stop whispering it? For 3 nights, the master's scream lingered in the house like a ghost that would not move on. It had risen from the cellar, sharp at first, then strangled, then abruptly gone. And when it died, the silence that followed was worse. The servants had waited for him to reappear, to climb the steps with his rage and his authority intact. But when Silas Wren came out, he was not the same man who had gone in. He said nothing of what he saw, only that the cellar was never to be opened again. The overseer sealed it himself, hammer shaking, each nail driven in with a prayer. Lime was poured across the threshold, then salt, then ash. But still, at night the boards seemed to breathe, swelling upward as if something below wished to rise. Silas began to waste away. His once imposing figure, broad and sunburnt, shrank to a trembling frame, his skin taking on the gray translucence of candle wax. His hair, once black as river mud, turned the color of bone. The tremor in his hands never stopped. Even in sleep they twitched as though remembering a rhythm not of this world. He no longer rode the fields, no longer shouted commands from the veranda. The workers whispered that the master had met his god and found him buried in the soil. The house obeyed his new silence. Curtains drawn, windows nailed, mirrors covered. The light seemed to avoid the man entirely, skirting him like a shadow skirting a grave. At meals he ate little. At night he drank until the candle burned down and the glass sweated in his hand. And always, always he forbade anyone to say her name. Not the slaves. Not the servants. Not even in prayer. Evelyn. The name had become a curse, for she too had changed. She no longer spoke to anyone, though her lips moved often in quiet conversation with something unseen. She walked barefoot now, her feet pale against the dark wood, her gown trailing through dust. Her skin gleamed white in the candlelight, almost translucent as though she had been hollowed of blood. Sometimes she would stand for hours at the window, hands pressed against the glass, eyes fixed on nothing. The servant said she could see through the world when she stared like that. The slave said she was looking for Jonas, listening for his footsteps beneath the ground. At night, they heard her humming again, the same song from the fields, but slower now, stretched thin as though it came from the bottom of a well. Once a maid claimed she saw her standing in the hall before dawn, head tilted slightly as if listening to the floorboards whisper beneath her feet. The girl left the next morning and never returned. The overseer begged Silas to send Evelyn away. "She's cursed, sir," he said, voice shaking. "The hands won't work. They think she calls the dead." But Silas, now a hollow man himself, could only mutter that there were no curses, only debts. He dismissed the overseer that same day. 2 nights later, the man's horse returned alone, bridle torn, eyes wide. By mid-autumn, the plantation had grown silent. The cane field stood rotted and dry, the stalks rattling in the wind like brittle bones. The enslaved whispered of leaving in the night, of crossing the river before frost. Some already had. The remaining few moved like phantoms between the shacks, avoiding the house entirely. They said that if you stood close enough to the cellar door, you could hear a heartbeat, slow, patient, and deep as thunder trapped beneath the floor. The narrator's voice grows low, almost reverent. A master who feeds on men will one day feed the worms. One evening, the last of the servants saw Silas pacing the hall, muttering to himself. He carried a lantern, though all the candles were lit. His steps creaked over the boards, pausing now and then as if he heard a reply beneath. When the servant approached, Silas turned on him with wild eyes and whispered, "Do you hear it? The roots, they're moving." The servant fled and was not seen again. After that, Silas kept mostly to his study. He wrote letters no one would ever read, tore them up and burned the scraps in his hand. The air grew heavy with ash and unspoken words. The smell of the cellar returned, sweet, wet, metallic, and no amount of lime could hide it. Evelyn drifted through the halls like smoke. Sometimes she stopped before her father's door and laid her palm against the wood. Sometimes she sang to him in that low, humming voice until he fell silent on the other side. The servants who dared to stay said she was gentler now, almost peaceful, but they never looked her in the eye. It was near the end of October when the plantation workers began to flee for good. The fields had grown dark with mildew, the wells tasted of iron, and the air felt wrong. Too thick, too warm, too alive. They said the ground pulsed at night, that the trees leaned toward the house as if to listen. One man swore he saw movement in the soil by moonlight, something vast like the turning of a body beneath a shroud. By the time the frost came, only Silas and his daughter remained. A father and child and the thing beneath them that would not rest. He sat by the fire one night staring into the embers. His hands trembled violently, but his voice when he spoke was calm, almost tender. He whispered to no one. It was only earth. But the house creaked in answer, and the flame dipped low, and somewhere deep below, the earth gave a long, wet sigh. Evelyn, standing in the doorway, smiled faintly, then turned and walked away, humming as she went, her bare feet leaving faint, damp prints on the wooden floor. The house waited. The earth listened. The worms had begun to stir. How long can a man bury his sins before the ground begins to dig them back up? There comes a heat so heavy it begins to eat sound. The air thickens. The cicadas fall silent, and even the birds perch open-mouthed in the trees, gasping like sinners before confession. That was the heat that settled over Cane Hollow the summer the fires began. The fields went first. The cane, dry as parchment, caught with no spark anyone could find. It started at the southern edge, a thin orange line that crept like handwriting across the night, spelling words no man could read. By dawn, half the crop was gone and the sky hung brown with smoke. The smell of burning sugar clung to the house, sweet and nauseating, like perfume poured over a wound. The slaves vanished one by one. Some ran for the river under cover of the haze, their footfalls swallowed by ash. Others were taken by the swamp. At least that was what the overseer said when he found their tools laid neatly in the rows as if set down mid-prayer. By midsummer, the quarters stood empty, doors open, beds cold. The only sound that came from that side of the land was humming, a low, steady tune drifting from the water's edge. Evelyn Wren was seen there often. Barefoot, gown clinging to her damp skin, she stood among the cattails at the lip of the swamp, staring into the black water that steamed even at midnight. Her hair hung loose and she hummed the same melody that had once haunted the house. Those who glimpsed her said the surface rippled in answer, as though something beneath stirred to her voice. They said she was feeding it, whatever it was, with her song. Inside the manor, Silas Wren withered faster than the crops. He barely spoke. His hands shook too violently to write, his eyes too clouded to read. The smell of smoke had sunk into his clothes, his beard, his breath. He began muttering of salvation, of cleansing, of driving the devil from his home. One morning he sent for a priest from the nearest parish, a man named Father Lattimore who had once blessed the plantation's baptisms and funerals in the same week. The priest came at dusk, sweating beneath his collar, clutching a small cross like a key he wasn't sure would fit the lock. Silas led him to the study where the wallpaper peeled in long strips and the windows sweated in the heat. He begged for a cleansing, an exorcism, anything to chase out the curse. Father Lattimore listened, eyes drifting toward the floorboards that groaned softly underfoot. When Silas finished, the priest rose and said only, "Some unions are older than Christ." He left before nightfall. The narrator's tone falls to a whisper. A house that asks for salvation too late will always be given fire instead. That evening, Silas drank from the bottle until the glass trembled against his teeth. He heard her humming again, faint at first, then clear, moving through the corridors like smoke through cracks. He followed the sound to the veranda, where he found his daughter standing beneath the red dusk. The sky above her swirled with ash. The fields glowed faintly at the horizon. She looked not at him but at the soil, her bare feet dark to the ankles as though the ground itself had claimed her. Silas demanded to know where Jonas was. He said the name like a curse, spitting it into the thick air. Evelyn turned slowly, her face serene, her eyes reflecting the orange of distant flames. Her voice was soft, but every word carried. "He is where you buried your mercy." Silas struck her then, not out of strength but terror. She did not move, did not flinch. The air between them shimmered, and the smell of scorched earth rose from nowhere. He stumbled back, clutching his chest. For the first time he saw his daughter clearly, not fragile, not mad, but ancient. The child he had despised was gone. In her place stood something the land itself had made in its own image. He retreated into the house. She remained on the porch until the sun vanished, her song threading through the rising wind. The clouds turned the color of rust. Somewhere in the distance, lightning crawled along the horizon, but no thunder followed. By midnight, the storm had reached the plantation. The wind tore at the roof, rattling shutters, driving sparks from the fields across the yard. Silas sat alone in his study, lantern guttering, the floorboards pulsing faintly beneath him. He could hear the house breathing again. He whispered a prayer to a God who had long stopped answering. The first spark found the veranda. Flame licked the paint, crawled to the drapes, kissed the rafters. Within moments, the whole house sighed, a sound of relief, of release, and caught. The fire rose in a column, swallowing room after room, painting the night gold. Silas tried to climb the stairs, calling his daughter's name, but the smoke met him halfway and drove him back. The portraits melted, their faces sliding down the canvas like tears. The ceiling cracked, dropping embers that glowed like eyes. Outside, Evelyn watched. The reflection of the burning manor trembled in the swamp water before her. She lifted her hands, palms open as though in benediction. Behind her, the cane fields erupted one after another, each explosion of light rolling outward like breath exhaled from the belly of the earth. The narrator's voice softens, reverent. Some fires begin in heaven, and some begin in guilt. When the roof collapsed, the sound carried for miles. Those few who had fled across the river swore the flames did not consume the house but drew into it, folding inward until nothing remained but a single glow at the foundation, like the ember of a dying heart. By dawn, Cane Hollow was ash and silence. The swamp steamed. The air smelled of sugar and blood. And yet, beneath the soot, beneath the charred beams, the soil was damp, alive. Did the fire cleanse the land, or did it only open the door wider for what waited below? And when a house burns to the ground, does its soul rise or stay? There are nights when the sky forgets it is meant to protect the world and instead decides to watch it burn. The air above Cane Hollow that night was thick with smoke and prophecy, and every gust of wind carried the taste of ruin. The flames that had begun in whispers along the veranda had grown into language, into a chorus of fury that sang through every room of the house. The plantation, once proud, once cruel, now roared like a dying beast at the end of its dominion. The narrator's voice slows, reverent and cold. It is a rare thing to witness a sin consuming itself. The house burned not like wood, but like memory. The fire did not climb. It unfurled, sliding up the walls with a strange grace, tracing the shape of every portrait, licking across the wallpaper that had listened to decades of screams. The windows shattered outward, scattering sparks into the night air like fireflies fleeing a dream. Each crack, each pop, each fall of timber sounded like confession. The slaves who had fled into the trees turned back to watch, unable to look away. They said the fire burned white at first, then gold, then something deeper, a color that belonged to the center of the earth. The sky above the plantation glowed red as an open wound, pulsing with the rhythm of something vast beneath. From the yard, the screams began. Some said they were Silas Wren's, others that the house itself was howling. But beneath the chaos another sound emerged, a low hum, steady, mournful, rising like a hymn from the depths of the cellar. It was Evelyn's song, now taken up by the wind, carried over the burning fields like the memory of sorrow turned to wrath. The roof gave way first. The upper beams collapsed inward, sending a rain of embers spiraling through the smoke. The staircase ignited like a ribcage catching light, its bones glowing before collapsing into the heart of the blaze. And there, framed for a moment in the window above the collapsing hall, stood Evelyn. Her silhouette burned bright against the inferno, her face calm, her eyes reflecting the firelight like two small suns. She smiled, not cruelly, not in madness, but in peace. The flames curled around her like arms, neither hurting nor holding. For a single heartbeat, she seemed more alive than she had ever been. Then the house exhaled. A sound rose from below. Deeper than thunder, deeper than the world itself, a long, guttural moan that made the air tremble. The ground shifted, heaving beneath the foundation. Cracks spiderwebbed across the courtyard and the earth split open, bleeding steam and light. The cellar door, long sealed and buried, burst apart in a shower of ash and stone. From the chasm that yawned beneath it came movement. The narrator whispers, "What rises from guilt is never clean." From the soil something began to emerge, slowly, deliberately, as though unfolding from a long sleep. It was vast and human-shaped, but not human. Its surface gleamed like wet clay, streaked with roots that pulsed faintly as veins. It bore the contours of both flesh and earth, its face shifting between forms. Sometimes Jonas, sometimes Evelyn, sometimes neither. Its eyes glowed the color of the fire it had been born from. The enslaved watching from afar fell to their knees. Some wept, some prayed, some turned and fled into the woods, their cries drowned by the roar of flame. The air was filled with the smell of salt and blood and burning sweetness. The thing reached upward, its massive hands pressing against the remains of the house as though lifting itself free from centuries of burial. When it rose to full height, it cast a shadow even against the firelight. The ground beneath it buckled. The house groaned once more, one long final sound, and then collapsed inward, vanishing into the churning red pit. The wind howled, and for an instant it seemed the whole world bowed, and then silence. By dawn, nothing remained of Cane Hollow but ash and smoke. The fields were gray, the trees blackened. The swamp steamed faintly, the water thick with soot. The air was still, the world hollowed by what it had witnessed. Only one soul was left alive to tell it. A young slave girl, no older than 14, found days later on the riverbank, her dress torn, her eyes wide and empty. When they asked what she had seen, she spoke only once. She said, "The earth swallowed them both." Then she fell silent and never spoke again. The narrator's voice lingers, soft as dust. Some stories do not end. They sink, they change shape. They wait beneath the ground until someone dares to remember them. In the months that followed, the land where Cane Hollow once stood was avoided by all. No birds flew overhead. No crops would grow. Travelers passing by at dusk claimed to see a faint red glow beneath the soil, and to hear humming low and sorrowful, drifting through the smoke-stained trees. What was it that rose from the cellar that night? A curse. A god or the sum of every cruelty buried in that soil? And when the earth finally closed its mouth, did it do so in mercy? Or in hunger? Morning spread over the ash like thin milk over a scorched pan, pale and unwilling to enter the burnt places. The plantation's bones cooled by inches. Chimney stumps, a staircase that went nowhere. The iron belly of a stove bulged and split like a ribcage struck by judgment. What the fire did not devour, the silence claimed, and in the stillness that follows a great unmaking, stories began to lift from the ground the way heat does, shimmering, uncertain, already choosing their shapes. The first to return were not the brave but the curious. Rivermen who had seen churches taken by floods, midwives who knew what blood keeps and what blood refuses to keep, children with ash on their calves and questions on their tongues. They picked through the cinders with broom handles and ox goads, poking the black crust of yesterday, listening for the hiss of something not yet finished dying. They found no bodies, no bones, only the cellar mouth sealed with char and earth, breathing a slow warmth as if the land had caught a fever it meant to keep. By month's end, the road to Cane Hollow had learned a new habit of avoidance. Carts gave the place a wide berth. Riders discovered they had reasons to turn back. Even the hawks that had once traced lazy circles over the fields chose a different sky. The ash, wetted by storm and footfall, sank into the red soil until the land darkened by a shade that made old men cross themselves. Nothing sprouted there. Seeds sweated and failed, a white rot clutching them as if the earth had learned at last to refuse the future. The legend began not with one witness but with many, a dozen versions, all wrong in the same right way. A lantern seen swaying where no hand carried it. A girl standing at the edge of the swamp, her gown not burned but glowing from within like a coal that had decided to remember its fire. A deep humming that could be mistaken for bees if not for the sorrow in it. And a second voice beneath, lower, patient, answering from the ground. At the mercantile in town, the clerk kept a tally he pretended was inventory. Each mark meant a stranger had asked about the plantation that fed itself. Preachers used the tale like a bit and bridle, their sermons jerking heavenward on the reins of fear. But in kitchens where the stove heat was honest and the talk unbuttoned, women said Evelyn Wren had been a sad child who found a god the way a drowning person finds air, not by searching, but by opening the mouth at the right moment and letting something in. Years peeled away. Seasons wrapped the ruin in new skin, kudzu, young pines, blackberry bramble stitching the foundation with thorn and sweetness. Boys dared each other to run a circle around the old well 3 times at dusk. Girls brought pins and pricked their fingers to see if the soil would take a taste. Hunters swore their dogs would not track past the cypress line but stood shivering, tails between their legs while the wind seemed to move without touching the leaves. What had once been a geography of wealth became a map of dread. And dread, like a tithe, was paid regularly and in small remembered coins. The narrator, that dark historian with a mercy for facts and none for vanity, notes how a place decides what to keep. Not the names carved on mantel clocks or pressed into courthouse ledgers, not the catalog of who owned whom and for how much, but the hum of a woman's breath at a window and the sound a house makes when it exhales its last oath. The earth kept that. The earth kept everything else too. A traveler, call him a scholar if you wish, though the papers in his satchel looked more like apologies than degrees, came one spring when the air had the clean blade of rain on it. He followed a direction that existed only in warnings. Go until the birds stop. Turn at the stump that smells like lightning. Walk toward where your hair lies down on your head and refuses to rise again. He found the place by absence. The forest thinned. The temperature faltered. The sky, even on a blue day, turned the color of a bruise. He stood where the front steps had been, though the steps were gone. Though the idea of them remained like a scar you can still itch. Moss had quilted the old stones, but in the seam between them the soil shone not red, not black, but a pantry of both, veined, damp, refusing dust. When he laid his palm there, the warmth he felt was not the sun's. It was the kind of heat the body remembers from another body. He thought, fool, honest fool, that he heard music. Not with the ear, with the blood. He took notes he would be ashamed to publish. He described a pressure that rose from the earth in pulses. He counted the seconds between them. He remembered a hymn he had not learned, and wrote down the spaces between the words instead. He told himself the hum was a trick of cicadas returning too early to a year that had not asked for them. He told himself many things. When he stood, the print of his hand filled with moisture. It did not evaporate as water does, it sank. The ground swallowed it delicately like a mouth taking communion. After that, the scholar slept badly in a boarding room whose window never quite latched. He dreamed of a white house burning without smoke. He dreamed of a girl who smiled as if she had discovered a mercy no one else could survive. He woke with grit under his nails and the taste of iron on his tongue. He left town 2 days later, lighter by one satchel and heavier by something he would never name. And on the train he sat with his hands folded to keep them from straying into the air, as if to test for a pulse. The county mapmakers returned the plantation to blankness. The taxman drew a neat square around nothing, and decided the nothing now belonged to the state. But stories are squatters with good lawyers. They live where law fails to notice them, and so Cane Hollow endured. A legend simple enough to retell across a porch rail and complicated enough to hold 12 kinds of guilt without snapping a single thread. It changed with each throat that carried it. In one telling, the earth had raised a bridegroom from bones. In another, it had taken back a daughter who was never permitted to leave. In every version, the land had eaten what men tried to own. Some nights, when weather came in from the Gulf and the air tasted of copper and forgiveness, folks along the river claimed the water swelled without wind and the frogs fell mute. Children woke and told their mothers that a woman had sung to them from the floorboards, a lullaby without words, and that a man's voice, low and patient, had promised the dark would hold. The mothers said the house was settling. The children learned not to answer songs that came from places hands could not reach. The legend. Then a house that learned to breathe, a soil that learned to hunger, a family that learned too late the difference between possession and belonging, and threaded through it like a red root you cannot pull without bringing the whole bank down. The simplest truth a land can teach. What you bury does not forget you. Winter took its turn. Then spring. Then summer again with its fat green insistence creeping close, trying to retake what the fire had sterilized. And always, under the fern and the thorn and the shy white faces of mushrooms the color of milk teeth, the ground kept its temperature, its slow throb, its appetite for the weight of remembering. If you stood there at dusk, would you swear the soil rose half an inch with the hum, as a chest does when the body gathers breath? And if you leaned closer, closer than is wise, what old name would the ground speak back into your mouth? Time, like a river swollen with rain, has a way of smoothing the jagged edges of cruelty until it gleams like stone. But beneath that polish the current still runs red. What Cane Hollow left behind was not ruin alone. It was hunger, deep and patient, buried in the skin of the earth. Years turned. Generations rose and fell. The Wren's name was erased from deeds and parish rolls, replaced by newer men with newer fortunes. Yet every time one of them tried to plant the land, the same sickness followed. Crops sprouted fast, too fast, their leaves bright and brittle, their roots black as ink. Livestock born on the property grew sickly and died before their first winter. Those who lived nearby said the ground was still feeding. Feeding on what? No one dared say aloud. The narrator's voice softens, almost tender, as if recounting a tragedy that was always meant to happen. Some sins are not inherited. They are swallowed, and they wait. In the decades after the fire, a family from Georgia bought the property, ignorant of its past. They built a small house on the hill and tilled the lower field. The first year was good. The soil, they said, was rich, almost too rich, its scent strong as iron. But by the second year, the roots came up twisted. By the third, the father went mad. He claimed the ground whispered to him at night, promising harvests that would never come. When he tried to burn the field, the fire turned back against the wind and took his house instead. His wife fled with their children, leaving the place to smolder and cool in silence once more. It was said that when they returned months later to salvage what they could, they found the father's footprints burned into the soil, facing downward, as though he had stepped into the earth rather than upon it. The place was abandoned again. Cane Hollow had learned to keep its distance from men, but the stories never stopped. Travelers who passed through after dark swore they saw flickers of light under the ground, pale glows like lanterns moving beneath the surface. Hunters reported finding bones that looked half human, half branch, their joints knotted like wood that had grown around something it refused to let go. Children who wandered too close came home with red mud under their nails and claimed they heard someone humming below their feet. The tune was always the same. Every generation gave the story new flesh, but the bones remained constant. A daughter wronged. A master consumed. A house that breathed and remembered. The sin that fed itself. In time, the legend grew teeth. The locals stopped calling it Cane Hollow and renamed it the Throat. They said the land there could swallow light, and that it was best not to linger when the sun dropped behind the pines. One woman, old and nearly blind, told a preacher that the devil himself had no power there, that the place was too full already. The preacher scoffed. 2 nights later, his church caught fire, though the sky had been clear. The narrator pauses, the rhythm slow and grave. We are a people who believe our cruelty evaporates when the deed is done. But cruelty is water, it seeps. It waits for the right season to bloom. In one of the last known accounts, dated 1904, a road crew working near the property unearthed something strange. Their shovels struck a patch of soil that rang hollow. When they dug deeper, they found a layer of dark clay shot through with what looked like veins. Some said it was tree root, others that it was flesh hardened by time. They broke it apart with picks. By noon, every man in that crew had blistered hands that oozed blood the color of rust. The foreman ordered the hole filled again. They did not speak of it afterward, but at night, when they camped along the river, one man woke to find his bedroll sinking into damp earth. He swore he heard breathing, steady, slow, enormous. He ran until dawn, and when he returned to town, he told anyone who would listen. The ground moves when it dreams. The narrator leans closer, voice low as confession. The sin that feeds does not die. It changes its hunger. They say now that the land has grown quiet again, but sometimes quiet is only a form of listening. The wind that moves through the trees carries a low vibration, like a hum without origin. On certain nights when the air is thick and the moon dull, the swamp releases bubbles that shimmer red before bursting, as if the earth itself exhales memory. The people who live nearby know better than to go near. They salt their thresholds. They pray to a god who has learned to keep his distance, and still the soil remains. Dark, damp, pulsing faintly, as though waiting for the next cruelty to feed upon, because the earth never hungers alone. It hungers with us. It learns from us. It remembers our flavor, and when it is ready to eat again, will it whisper our names too? 100 years have passed, but time cannot bleach red from the earth. The forest has reclaimed the hill where Cane Hollow once stood. Its canopy folds like a cathedral roof, heavy with vines that hang in silence. There are no paths now, only faint hollows where carriage wheels once pressed, now filled with moss. The air there is still different, thicker, as though the world itself takes a shallower breath above that ground. It is said that no compass works near the ruins. The needle spins, as if it remembers too many directions at once. Travelers pass by without noticing until a chill grazes their neck, the kind that doesn't belong to shade or weather. Then they know they've crossed the old border. They've stepped into the breath of a story that never ended. One such traveler, a historian with ink on his hands and disbelief in his bones, came looking for the truth. He had heard the tales of a daughter cursed, a master consumed, a house that fed itself, and he wanted proof that ghosts are nothing more than memory given shape by fear. He found the site by mistake, or perhaps the way one finds a dream by walking into it. The trees parted as if an invitation. He stood among the remains. Blackened brick, fragments of porcelain, a rusted hinge still clinging to nothing. The wind passed through the trees without sound. He bent down, brushed away the leaf litter, and found the soil beneath was still red, damp, warm, pulsing faintly beneath his fingertips. He told himself it was a trick of the sun. He told himself many things, yet when he pressed his palm deeper, the ground seemed to shift. A slow exhalation rose from below. Neither heat nor cold, just presence. The hum that had haunted generations returned, not loud, not near, but everywhere. It filled the space between his heartbeats. He lifted his hand and saw, to his horror or awe, that the print he left glistened. not with moisture, but with blood-dark clay that seemed to pulse like a vein. He wiped it away. It reappeared. The narrator's voice drops low. Every historian dreams of finding what cannot be proven. But what is proof to a land that remembers more than men ever will? As dusk fell, the forest deepened in color. The shadows stretched long and red like stains spreading through fabric. The historian tried to leave, but the air pressed against him, heavy and expectant. He felt watched. Beneath his feet, the ground shifted again, small at first, then rhythmic like breath. And faintly, through the thrum of the earth came the sound of two voices humming, one soft, one low, in perfect unison. He ran then. Branches tore at his coat, roots caught his feet, but he did not stop until the forest thinned and the road reappeared dusty and ordinary. Only then did he dare look back. The clearing was gone. In its place, the forest stood untouched, as if nothing had ever existed there. Yet the wind carried something with it, faint, metallic, familiar. The smell of iron, of blood, of soil that would not forget. He left his notes behind. The locals found them months later, pages filled with sentences that began clearly and ended in smudges. The ink blurred as though the paper had wept. The last line, barely legible, read, "The earth remembers who it fed." Years later, the same hill bloomed red clover every spring, though no seed was ever planted there. Children from nearby towns would pick the flowers, press them between books, and watch as the petals darkened over time, turning the color of dried rust. Their mothers told them not to bring those flowers home. Some disobeyed. Those who did said that at night, when their rooms grew quiet, they could hear the faint hum of a woman's voice rising from the vase, singing to the soil through the glass. The narrator breathes the final words softly, as though closing a book that was never meant to be opened. Time forgets men like Silas Wren. It forgets their cruelty, their wealth, their prayers. But the ground keeps perfect memory. Every drop of sweat, every tear, every cruelty pressed beneath it is catalogued in the language of decay. You can plow it, pave it, rename it, but the land will speak again. It always does. The wind swells once more and the camera would fade to black. Only the sound remains, the slow rhythm of breathing beneath the soil. Cane Hollow was not just a story of a house or a family. It was a reminder that cruelty does not vanish, it transforms. The sins of men ferment in the silence of the ground until the earth grows a mouth to speak them back. So the question lingers, like a heartbeat under dust. Do you believe the land can remember? Or are we the ones who keep digging until it finally answers? If you felt the chill of this tale, don't let it vanish into the dark. Subscribe, share, and return next time for another story the earth refused to forget.